while there is certainly no shortage of disagreements here in Washington, I think one thing where there is wide consensus is that once again the United States finds itself in the midst of a great power competition. How American foreign policy should adapt and respond is, of course, very much a point of contention. But I don't think there's really any debating that this new reality does exist, and it does require a careful reevaluation of how we approach every issue, including human rights. On the one hand, if our adversaries, principally China, Russia, and Iran, are successful in tipping the global balance of power in favor of their repressive regimes, it would have a devastating impact on fundamental rights and liberty around the world. On the other hand, it is clear that we will need to grapple with difficult trade-offs and choices as our resources and capital come under increasing strain. To talk about the best path forward for American human rights policy, I am pleased to be joined by a fantastic panel, starting with my immediate left, Elliott Abrams, currently a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. For close to 4 decades now, Elliott has been a leader on human rights policy, going back to his work as Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs in the Reagan administration, and of course in positions in the George W. Bush and Trump administrations. Olivia Enos is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where she specializes in human rights and national security challenges in Asia. Among other countries, her work focuses on China and North Korea, and she covers issues including democracy and governance, religious freedom, and forced labor and human trafficking. Dan Twining is president of the International Republican Institute. Dan previously has worked in a number of positions in the State Department and Congress, and of course, most notably for today as Senator John McCain's foreign policy advisor. And finally, Peter Berkowitz is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and from 2019 to 2021, he served as the director of the State Department's policy planning staff, along with roles as the executive secretary for the Commission on Unalienable Rights and senior advisor to the Secretary of State. Thank you all for joining me today. Dan, I want to kick it off with a question to you. Now, this panel is entitled Human Rights in an Age of Great Power Competition. And this, of course, assumes that human rights still should figure into this clash that we have against this axis of revisionist powers. Is that assumption correct? And if so, how do you think each side's perspectives on fundamental freedoms will influence how they approach this confrontation?
Thanks, Corban. I'm very happy to be here with such a wonderful group, and thank you, Corban, for your and the McCain Institute's outstanding leadership in this space. Look, I will make, in response to your question, a very functional case for why this is an element in great power competition. But I would just like to say, for the record, I think it would be rather strange for us only to support the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution in the United States and nowhere else in the world, right? Unalienable rights. I would argue that all people have them everywhere. So we'll set aside the moral case and make the strategic argument. Look, our enemies, our authoritarian adversaries, by the way, they are all authoritarians, are working together in literally historically unprecedented ways. So right now, you have a North Korean army fighting in Europe with Iranian weapons paid for by Russian oil sold to China. China and Russia are collaborating more actively today than Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany collaborated on the eve of World War II, right? So this is not theoretical, it's really happening. Authoritarians seem to have enjoyed extraordinary strategic momentum and initiative over the past 4 years. I would argue America did not have a strong enough set of policies to prevent that. We can take the initiative and take advantage of our adversaries' greatest Achilles heel, their greatest vulnerability, which is their fear of their own publics. Now, don't take it from me. There are excellent human rights activists here, some associated with the McCain Institute. They can tell you the true story of the mood of the people in their countries. IRI just supported a poll in Iran. It's very difficult to do, but we support polling in all sorts of closed societies. So I've got some numbers. Guess what the Iranian people think? They think, 80% of them think, that their country's terrorist supporting, war on Israel supporting foreign policy does nothing for them, 80%. More Iranians 2/3 of Iranians support normalizing relations with the United States. More Iranians support normalizing relations with the United States than support the axis of resistance. Less than half of Iranians believe Iran should be supporting financially the axis of resistance, which is Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, etc. 3 in 4 young Iranians, so among Iranians under 30, 3 in 4 of them would like to emigrate. They would like to leave their country. 3 in 4 of them say their regime does nothing for their prosperity or their prospects. I'm mentioning these numbers because there is just an enormous gap between what these leaders say, Xi Jinping, Putin, the Ayatollahs in Iran. They claim to speak for their people, but they don't. And in fact, they run authoritarian, in some cases totalitarian, in China's case, systems of control. China has more internal security forces than it does in the People's Liberation Army. The People's Liberation Army is the largest armed forces in the world. There are more people working on internal security in China. So I know we'll unpack some of these things, but Corban, my argument would be, why don't we do what Ronald Reagan did and say, you know, supporting America wants to have strong relations with the people of these countries, and their leaders have taken them on the wrong path, right? Iranians do not want a policy that produces war and chaos in the Middle East, a set of foreign policies. Most Russians, in fact, do not want to send their children to die in Ukraine, alongside North Korean soldiers and convicts out of prison. Most Russians do not want that. Most Chinese would like to have a more normal life and not fight a war against the United States or invade Taiwan or the Philippines or any other neighbors. So a policy that speaks to and supports the people of these countries. I would particularly point out, just in the moment we're in, Venezuela, where the Maduro regime lost the election. We know it, it lost, it's documented. The transition is still underway. The inauguration is not set to take place for another month. There's an extraordinary opportunity to lean in Venezuela and support a democratic outcome there. And based on those numbers I mentioned, and I think President Trump's history with Iran, including the fact that they keep trying to kill him and his officials, there is a great opportunity using peaceful means for the United States to use maximum leverage to bring about real change in Iran. And wouldn't that change the equation? Wouldn't that make people like Vladimir Putin maybe think a little less about swallowing foreign countries, Ukraine, Georgia, the Baltics, and maybe a little more about taking care of citizens at home?
Thanks, Dan. And just to follow up on the point you mentioned about Reagan, Elliott, you know, this is, of course, not the first great power competition that America has faced. In 1981, you wrote a memo for the State Department for President Reagan addressing how the issue of human rights should factor into American foreign policy in that Cold War. And you wrote, quote, "Human rights, meaning political rights and civil liberties, gives us the best opportunity to convey what is ultimately at issue in our contest with the Soviet bloc. The fundamental difference between us is not in economic or social policy, but in our attitudes towards freedom. We need not only a military response to the Soviets, we also need an ideological response, which reminds our citizens and theirs what the game is all about and why it is worth the effort. We aren't struggling for oil or wheat or territory, but for political liberty." Now, history has borne out that the Reagan administration was one of the most successful administrations on human rights that we have seen. What are some of the keys to that success, and what are some of the lessons and principles from Reagan's approach that the Trump administration should adapt today?
Thanks, Corban, and thank you all for being here. There are 4 or 5 points I'd make about Reagan human rights policy and why it was successful. And the first one is it has to come from the top. It can't just be bureaucratized. If the ambassador to a non-democratic, human rights violating country says the U.S. ambassador says some things, but it's clear that he or she really speaks alone, not for the Secretary of State, not for the President, it's not going to work, or it's not going to work very well. One of the keys in the Reagan case was that it was clear that an ambassador who was making these points was making the same points that Secretary of State Schultz and President Reagan were making. So first, it does have to appear to be an administration policy, a presidential policy, an American policy, not just that of an ambassador. Second, I think it can't be a purely instrumentalized policy. And by that I mean that it can't be a policy of where you're tough on your adversaries or enemies, but when it comes to the violations by your allies, mum's the word. That's not a human rights policy. That's a sensible policy of criticizing your adversaries, but it's not a human rights policy, and therefore will not be taken seriously as a principled support for human rights. Third, Reagan understood and Schultz understood deeply that the fate of human rights in the world, fate of democracy in the world, are related to American power. They're not going to prosper in a world in which the United States appears to be in decline, and authoritarian or totalitarian powers, such as China, appear to be on the rise. They are the powers of the future. There's no way that human rights in the world can be dissociated from the United States and from American power. And Reagan understood that deeply. Fourth, and you mentioned this, you got to make the ideological argument. You can't be shy about it. The terms like Axis or evil regime. And Reagan was broadly criticized for calling the Soviet Union an evil regime. But many of you will know this story that Natan Sharansky, then serving his 9 years in the Gulag, said, when Reagan said that, it got through to the Gulag. And those of us who were prisoners thought, oh, finally, an American president who gets it, who sees what's at stake. And we need to do that. We need to call evil regimes and evil practices and evil violations of human rights by those words. Having said that, I guess this is fifth, Reagan was also pragmatic in how he sought to bring about change. That is, once you've said the Soviet Union is an evil regime, you don't necessarily then say, and we will never speak to them, and we will never negotiate with them. Of course, that was not what he did. You need to, it isn't a helpful human rights policy to say to a dictator, president, prime minister, king, you really need to go away. Your regime needs to commit suicide. You've got to figure out, what can we actually do? What changes are possible? I remember, for example, in the George W. Bush years, one of the things we did with Saudi Arabia, which is an absolute monarchy, was not to say, hey, you have to have elections. That would not have been useful. We talked to them about religious freedom, because as people who said they were deeply religious and cared about religion and worship, we thought there is a way to open that door for more ability to practice religion by non-Sunni Muslims in Saudi Arabia. In just one other brief story, we had information about the trafficking of boys to the United Arab Emirates to be camel jockeys, literally, because they're small and lightweight, makes them good jockeys for camels. We didn't denounce the UAE. We went to them and said, this is terrible. It's going to hurt your reputation. You do not want human rights groups denouncing you for this. Fix it. And they did. They eliminated the practice. Most of these boys came from Pakistan, actually. They stopped it cold. That was the end of it. You can now go to this day to camel races in the UAE, and you have, I don't know what to call them, electronic, non-human jockeys. It worked. They eliminated the practice because they understood what we were saying to them about it. I guess I'd say one last thing. And you said these words. I don't think that our policy is going to work if we take the most controversial and novel definitions of human rights in the United States, the ones that we may have adopted yesterday morning, and immediately try to universalize them, particularly in cultures which we know will reject them. The Reagan human rights policy was a policy that supported political rights, basically those found in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR. The fundamental rights, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, for example, which we thought were universal and were in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ICCPR, which had actually been agreed to by many of the countries we were addressing. So Reagan's policy on human rights stuck to those basic, those fundamental civil and political rights. And I think that contributed a good deal to the policy's success.
And turning from the memo you wrote in 1981, which I think was one of the clearest articulations of the role of human rights in the first Cold War, turning to Peter, speaking of unalienable rights and fundamental freedoms, the report of the Commission on Unalienable Rights, I think, will hopefully go down ultimately as one of the most important policy documents on human rights in this current era of great power competition. I think it was certainly a shame that the Biden administration shelved the report. I certainly look forward to working with you to try to bring a little bit more interest to it in the coming years. But in the report's introduction, it notes that, quote, human rights are now misunderstood by many, manipulated by some, rejected by the world's worst violators, and subject to new ominous threats. It goes on to recognize that, quote, not only are Russia and China engaging in repressive policies domestically, they are also actively attempting to promote their despotic political models internationally. Can you describe a little bit what was the purpose for the Unalienable Rights Report, and in particular, how should its findings guide how we approach human rights policy in this new great power competition?
Happy to do so, and thanks for the opportunity. In July 2019, Mike Pompeo established the Commission on Unalienable Rights, and he gave that commission a mandate. The mandate was to reground America's undoubted commitment to human rights, but to reground it in America's founding principles, constitutional traditions, and the obligations that we took on in 1948 when we voted in the General Assembly in favor of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, why was this regrounding necessary? Well, two reasons. One, there had been a proliferation of rights, the foundations of rights had grown hazy, and rights had come to be associated with the progressive political agenda. But second, this was less emphasized, but it was an important factor. As a result of the association of human rights with the progressive political agenda, many conservatives had said, we don't want anything to do with that. Pompeo wanted to correct both of those errors. And because he understood that rights were inscribed in America's fundamental principles and constitutional traditions and our obligations, so he asked us to return to the tradition, return to the UDHR, return to American foreign policy. I must mention in passing that he made an inspired choice to head the commission, the great Marianne Glendon, who had been his teacher at Harvard Law School. Very quickly, the report is divided into 5 parts. Part 1 explains the 4 audiences for the report. One audience was Secretary Pompeo. He wanted clarification. Second audience was the State Department. Third audience was fellow citizens, and a fourth audience was friends and partners around the world. I want to emphasize in connection to that audience, friends and partners. The report adopts the approach of Jacques Maritain, who had argued in 1947 and 1948 as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being drafted, that it was reasonable to hope that peoples and nations of the world could agree on a small set of basic rights and fundamental freedoms, a small set of principles that no state would want to acknowledge it had violated, some obligations that all states would want to assert that they honored. That was reasonable. But second, it was not reasonable to suppose that the peoples and the nations of the world would use the same arguments, would reason from the same premises. So, Mary Taine said, the peoples and the nations of the world should be encouraged to look to their own traditions, moral, political, religious traditions, to find the resources within their cultures, their nations, for affirming the small set of principles. So, while our report, it's an American report on unalienable rights, we rely heavily on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And while we say in the report, we'd be delighted if peoples and nations of the world learn, as we have, from John Locke, from James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, from Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. They learn from them, that's terrific. But really we're offering an invitation to do as we've done by turning to your own traditions and finding the resources to come together, as Elliott said, to affirm some very basic ideas. No torture, no slavery, no arbitrary arrest and detention, protection of freedom of speech, protection of freedom of religion. Believe me, if the human rights community focused on these matters, we would still be working over time. Time is short, so I will just say that the second part of our report dealt with the distinctive American political tradition of rights, and I will assert here that just about every seminal reform in American history involves an appeal to the Declaration of, to the principle of the Declaration of Independence. By the way, the first time ever in human history, a nation was created devoted to a universal principle that rights are inherent in its purpose of government to secure them. One part of the report is devoted to reading, a close reading of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which presents an interlocking set of principles. It's not, the UDHR is not something from which people should choose. At the same time, there are different kinds of principles and rights in the UDHR. Some of the provisions of the UDHR are given as absolutes. No one shall be deprived. This shall not be done to people. But others, like social and economic rights, are explicitly presented as relative to the social organization of specific countries. We look at new challenges for human rights. We talk about the politicization of international organizations. We talk about migration. We talk about artificial intelligence. And as Corban said, we especially emphasize what we regarded as the #1 threat to human rights in our era, the Chinese Communist Party leading the People's Republic of China, which not only maintains a one-party repressive dictatorship at home, but seems bent on transforming world order to make it more favorable to authoritarianism. I will close by saying that we had one great diplomatic success, which is that the world's largest independent Muslim organization, Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia, 100 million members, embraced our report, said it expressed their understanding of toleration and pluralism. They invited Marianne Glendon and me to Jakarta to present the report. When Secretary Pompeo heard about it, he said, "I'm going too." And he did, and he presented the report. And notwithstanding Secretary Blinken's deeply misguided, I use his word, repudiation of the report, Nahdlatul Ulama, 100 million strong in Indonesia, remains eager to work with the United States based upon America's founding principles and constitutional traditions, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also gives expression to those universal ideas.
And just to follow up on the specific, one of the specific universal rights that you mentioned was freedom from slavery. The issue of human trafficking and forced labor has long been an issue that the McCain Institute has focused on. Ambassador McCain is certainly a champion on that. Olivia, we've kind of talked in broad terms up to now, but I want to ask you something a little bit more concrete. I know you have done a lot of work on forced labor as it relates to the Uyghurs. What do you think are maybe some of the top 2 or 3 things that the incoming Trump administration should do to, for example, strengthen the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and to just address what is happening in Xinjiang?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, at the outset, I just want to say thank you to Corban and to the McCain Institute for coordinating this conversation today that really recognizes the centrality of human rights to broader U.S. foreign policy, especially when we're having conversations about great power competition and especially as they relate to China, because I think this is too infrequently discussed. I cannot overstate how very essential to the Chinese Communist Party the violation of human rights are. Issues that the U.S. has historically considered peripheral, like the ongoing genocide of and crimes against humanity facing Uyghur Muslims, the erasure of Tibetan culture, the undermining of freedom and human rights in Hong Kong that we all bore witness to in 2020. The U.S. government has often viewed these issues as peripheral, but those are viewed by the CCP as central to their maintenance of power. And so I think it is well past time for the U.S. to recalibrate our foreign policy in a way that tackles and undermines the CCP's ability to maintain power through its ongoing human rights violations. And I think it's important to recognize, and there's a fabulous book by Andrew Nathan and Andrew Scobell called China's Search for Security that argues that China's core foreign policy interests are to maintain internal stability and to safeguard sovereignty. And each of the issues I just mentioned that the US considers peripheral are central to the CCP's ability to achieve those foreign policy objectives. So the question that you directed to me, Corban, was, what does that look like in a second Trump term in an ideal world? And I run a China human rights working group out of Hudson that is going to be releasing a policy memo in January that will hopefully outline even more recommendations than what I'm going to highlight here. But I just wanted to highlight 3 buckets of issues that I think the Trump administration should focus on. First, holding CCP perpetrators of human rights violations accountable. Yes, that means traditional tools like using targeted financial measures like Global Magnitsky that allows us to target individuals and entities on human rights grounds in a way that causes them to face financial consequences. But it also means using some of the stronger tools that we have in our toolkit, like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which deserves far greater efforts and political will to ensure enforcement and also consequences, particularly for repeat violators of the UFLPA who are bringing goods produced with Uyghur forced labor here into U.S. markets where you and I may be becoming, unknowingly complicit in the CCP's human rights violations. It also means considering stronger financial tools of engagement like those that Treasury has to be able to designate sets of transactions or specific entities as primary money laundering concerns, which we've had success with in the North Korean context, but we have stopped short of using in the Chinese context. The second bucket of recommendations would be to provide support for people across China. That means extending refugee safe haven. I heard this came up in the last panel as well, considering whether certain groups that are especially persecuted might be eligible for priority 2 refugee status, or making better use of a reformed version of humanitarian parole, especially for political prisoners that we're seeking the release of. We should be doing more and placing a higher emphasis on securing political prisoner release in general. To me, it's unbelievable that we have no central authority within the executive branch to prioritize the release of political prisoners, but this is one of the most practical steps that the US government could undertake to help people who have put their lives on the line to stand against authoritarianism. And finally, to provide financial support for survivors of genocide in especially Uyghur Muslims. The third bucket and final bucket of issues that I wanted to address bring the CCP's human rights violations directly to our shores. And this has to do with policies surrounding transnational repression. Too often we assume that the CCP's human rights violations are only affecting folks in China. And of course, that should be enough to motivate us to take action. But it's coming to our own shores in the US, in the UK, in Australia. I have friends of mine who work in Hong Kong, or who are Hong Kong pro-democracy advocates who have bounties on their head because the Hong Kong government has targeted and sought to silence them even beyond China's borders. So we need to strengthen the legal mechanisms to support victims of transnational repression so that when they're in our own countries, they know that they have access to guarantees and protections that ordinary Americans typically enjoy. And we need to do so in a way that works with and cooperates with allies and partners who do share our interests and share our values, because I think our strength and our ability to act, our ability to defend human rights is in no small part predicated on the strength of those alliances.
Thanks for that. Elliott, I want to turn back to you, just thinking about, again, more concrete steps that we should be expecting an incoming Secretary of State, Rubio, for example, to take. I wonder if the Western Hemisphere is going to be more of a priority with him running the State Department. And I know you've done a lot of work recently looking at Venezuela, looking at the sanctions, looking also at the effects. Olivia mentioned just the business connections and interest in China. Obviously in Venezuela with the oil, it's the same. What are some of the things that Secretary Rubio, that the Trump administration should be looking at within the Western Hemisphere on human rights?
Well, in the Western Hemisphere, there are a few terrible dictatorships. Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua are the three that I would mention. The Biden administration has quite a mixed record on these. Just as an example, there's an awful lot of oil production going on, a growing amount, by American oil companies in Venezuela. That was not permitted 4 years ago and should not be permitted, partly for the political message that it sends. How seriously is the Maduro regime to take speeches about human rights abuses if the American government won't then say to American oil companies, get out of there? I don't think we've maximized the pressure that can be brought to bear on Cuba or Nicaragua either. And I think over the next 4 years, there will be opportunities. The situation in Venezuela, I'll try to be very brief. Situation in Venezuela is different now because everyone knows, every government knows that the July 28th presidential election was stolen and the regime is less legitimate than it has ever been. Daniel Ortega is quite sick. It's perfectly plausible that he will pass away in the coming 4 years. That's a really important turning point in Nicaragua because his heir in power as dictator is likely his wife, who's even more unpopular than he is. So that creates a moment when Nicaraguans, including even the Nicaraguan army, may say, okay, what do we do now? And that's an opportunity for the United States. Cuba, finally, you can see the economy collapsing, totally collapsing. You can see the blackouts that go on for days. And again, over a 4-year period, I'm not suggesting that all these countries are going to be admirable democracies 4 years from today. But in each of them, there are opportunities pragmatically to say to the regimes, if you want relief from sanctions, if you want assistance, here's what you need to do, starting, for example, with the release of political prisoners.
Peter, want to turn to you. The other report that was notable that came out during your time working with Secretary Pompeo dealt with China specifically. So the goal of that report was securing America's freedom, particularly vis-a-vis China. What does securing America's freedom look like, and how does that have an impact on freedom more globally?
It has a major impact on freedom more globally because, as we emphasized in the report, the China challenge is not restricted to the Indo-Pacific. It is not restricted to deterring a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party is engaging in predatory economic policies in every region of the world. The purpose of these predatory economic policies is to induce the independence, induce dependence by nation states on the Chinese Communist Party and to assist the Chinese Communist Party in altering world order. So this is a worldwide challenge. What can be done? We've already talked about some policies. Since time is short, I will emphasize one matter that I think is important. And this comes from the great Jimmy Lai. In 2019, he was interviewed at Stanford, at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. This was before the CCP crackdown on Hong Kong, about 6 months before it. And toward the end of the interview, he was asked, so, Mr. Lai, what can the United States do to assist the people of Hong Kong in their struggle for freedom and democracy? And he replied poignantly, we don't need higher or lower tariffs. We don't need machine guns and we don't need tanks. What would be most helpful to us right now is if America would stop being embarrassed about its principles. I don't think we can overestimate. It connects to the story that Elliott told about Sharansky. I don't think we can overestimate the importance to people who are struggling for freedom and democracy around the world, to an America that stands boldly for its principles, which are universal principles.
And so on that point, I want to close with the question I'll direct both to Dan and to Olivia. One of the most important thing that we do at the McCain Institute is carry forward the legacy and values of Senator John McCain. And you will see throughout this today different aspects of his legacy and his values that are highlighted. One thing that I wanted to highlight on this panel is that John McCain was a conservative. And I think that's important to note, particularly with regards to human rights, because it's seen often as something that is more the domain of the left. But I think Senator McCain showed every single day that being a conservative working on human rights was not just something to be in the passenger seat, it was something to be in the driver's seat for. And so Dan and Olivia, Dan, you worked for the senator. So the question for you is, how did his conservative principles inform his human rights work? And Olivia, has those of us who are on the cusp of the next generation of conservatives worked on human rights, what are maybe some of the top 2 or 3 principles that should ground how we think about it moving into the 21st century?
Thank you, Corban. I mean, I think we all want to build the broadest possible coalition to defend and support human rights in the world. So we'll take left, right, and center, all of the above. If you're a conservative, you fundamentally believe in limited government. You understand that the greatest threat to individual liberty is tyranny, right? And so John McCain was just innately hostile to authoritarians because the purpose of government is to secure individual rights. Authoritarians believe the purpose of government is essentially for citizens to serve the state. And it's highly illiberal. So, I mean, we can connect this to the left side of the political. It's highly illiberal. If you care about human development, human welfare, social justice, you're never going to get those in a country like Cuba or China, where government wields overwhelming authority to determine the course of your life, even if you are not politically active or politically outspoken in any way. That tyranny just crushes human aspiration in the most fundamental way. Therefore, limited government, checks and balances, accountability, regular elections, holding leaders to account, an active civic life, right, a civil society that balances overweening government power. No, none of these principles produce heaven on earth, right? We're still human beings. It's still going to be messy. But look, free and open societies do not invade and try to swallow their neighbors. They do not export uncontrolled mass migration. All these desperate people wanting to leave Venezuela, the quarter population's already left. People don't want to leave, people want to stay home, but their country is ruined. It's broken by a set of bad men at the top. Free and open societies do not produce the kind of violent extremism that came home right here on 9/11, right? So when we come back to international security, whether it's conservative principles, principles on the left, we know that democracies are sources of stability. Now, democracies can look unstable. Look at what's going on in France today, right? There is internal instability, but those instabilities come from citizens and politicians essentially fighting peacefully over policy outcomes. That's a much better source of instability than, say, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, or the nature of the Syrian state or the Venezuelan state, or a place like Burma or Sudan today that's just totally broken, where people have no opportunity and no hope.
And I'll try to move through this quickly, but I would just say a limited government approach recognizes the vitality, resilience, and consistency of civil society. That means that no matter who is the president, who is sitting in Congress, who's sitting in the executive branch, that the agency that individuals have to effectuate change is something that we can count on and that we can have hope for. And I think one of the things that I would like to see conservatives recapture, especially in our conversations around rights, is not only the emphasis on rights, but on duties as well. The duty to protect and to defend those rights, the duty to hold our governments accountable, that we feel a sense of personal responsibility for the defense of rights, both in our own country, but also in countries abroad. And I think part of taking that responsibility means that you have care for, yes, yourself as an individual, but care and love for your neighbor at the heart of policy making. And for me, that gives me a lot of confidence. The areas that I would be very excited to see forward progress on in particular are areas that I think conservatives have historically championed around religious freedom, which I think has really helped to promote human rights globally. But I think there's a real need to also strengthen policies surrounding freedom of speech and freedom of expression, because I think in some conversations we've kind of lost the plot. One final note that I would make is that I worry about conservatives becoming two sides of the same coin, where we're only focused on what the government can be doing for us. And that makes me nervous about the growth in government, as opposed to the focus on individual responsibility. And so I would just caution all of us to look for ways to preserve that idea of limited government, and to not always be looking for the government to just deliver on particular issues that are important to us. So
Yeah, thank you for that. So one of the important things that we do at the McCain Institute, we have a leadership program. We want to train the next generation. I think with folks like Olivia on the cusp, I think we are in good hands. And certainly when you have the wise old folks like Elliott, like Peter, Dan somewhere in between, I guess, young, old, I don't know. But so join me in thanking the panel, and thank you very much.